Welcome everyone to Maryknoll. Good afternoon. I am Chuck Bottis. I am the chair of Maryknoll Fathers and Brothers Community Outreach Program. I'd like to welcome all of you to our first Food for Thought event of 2021. We're very pleased to have all of you with us today, and we are honored to welcome Father Frank Breen as our host for today's event, and he will be guiding us toward a better understanding of Pope Francis' third encyclical, Fratelli Tutti. A little bit of Father Breen's background. Father Breen was ordained a Maryknoll priest in 1970, after which he was assigned to Kenya. He was stationed in a densely populated rural district in Western Kenya, where he organized youth programs, Bible classes, leadership training, women's development projects, courses, and initiated small Christian communities, all while overseeing construction of cement block churches in outstations of the parish. In 1980, Father Breen was assigned to the development department, working first in Detroit and then in Washington, D.C. He returned to Kenya in 1983, where he stayed for 5 years doing projects and pastoral work. In 1988, Father Breen spent 1 year with the Social Communications Department at Maryknoll and returned to Kenya as a full-time Africa correspondent for Maryknoll magazine. In this position, he visited all the countries of East Africa, as well as the Middle East and several countries of Southern Africa, including South Africa. Beginning in 2008, Father Breen wrote a 5-volume history of the Maryknoll mission in Africa, covering the history of Maryknoll in Tanzania, Kenya, Sudan, Ethiopia, and 6 other countries. In 2015, Father Breen was appointed to the newly formed Pastoral Visitors Team at Maryknoll, New York. He is currently a member of the Maryknoll Office for Global Concerns and the Maryknoll Representative to the United Nations. Will you please join me in welcoming Father Frank Breen?
Good, thank you. Thank you. So I should just begin now, huh? So here we are, the encyclical Fratelli Tutti. It came out, I think, in October of last year. This is the real title of it, Love That Transcends Barriers of Geography and Distance. And the Pope hopes that it'll lead to a rebirth of universal aspiration to fraternity. Next slide, please. This is a very long encyclical. It's got 8 chapters. They're all pretty long. You can read all the different things here. Chapter 2, the parable of the Good Samaritan. It talks about social friendship, solidarity, human migration, a healthy politics, authentic social dialogue. Chapter 7, very important on a number of topics, similar to war, peace, nonviolence, nuclear weapons, and so forth. And finally, the positive role of religions. It ends with 288 citations, and women have noted that none of those citations are from a woman. All 288 citations are from a man. And in fact, even the 5 people who are given as exemplary models for us at the end are all men. Once again, we'll see that at the end. But let's go now to the next slide. This is the dark chapter, chapter 1, Dark Clouds Over a Closed World. Next slide, please. This will give us a list of some of the things the Pope is talking about. A regression from integration, such as Brexit, where we're not integrating together, we're breaking apart. Old conflicts, the rise of nationalism, economic inequality. I'll have some more comments on that. Lack of concern for the common good. A single cultural model for the whole world. The loss of historical consciousness. The Pope says some humans are sacrificed for the benefit of others, such as elderly people considered dispensable, reducing labor costs through structural unemployment, women's lack of equal rights, and modern forms of slavery through the abominable vice of trafficking. Then he goes on to talk also about fear and mistrust. People are trying to ensure stability and peace through a false sense of security, sustained by a mentality of fear and mistrust. And finally, he talks about a culture of walls, walls in the heart and walls on the land. Let's go to the next slide here. The Pope is definitely a globalist. He talks about globalization, and there are many global advances, science, medicine, industry, and technology. But there is still injustice in the world. Here's these statistics. I just got them yesterday from the World Economic Report for 2020. Last year in the United States, the 644 billionaires saw their net worth rise from $2.98 trillion to $3.88 trillion. So the 644 billionaires made a net gain of $1 trillion last year. At the same time, 8 million Americans lost jobs, and globally 2.7 billion workers are adversely affected by the pandemic. The Pope says we seem to lack a shared roadmap as the world races ahead. We are a global community. We must not forget the lessons of history. Next slide. In an absence of human dignity on the borders, the Pope is very concerned about this. You can see that picture. And he says it's accompanied by a rise of fear and xenophobia and fomented by certain populist political regimes. Let's go to the next slide. The Pope talks about the digital revolution, which has many positives, of course, but some of the negative things, and this is a very important comment he makes. Things that until a few years ago could not be said by anyone without risking the loss of universal respect can now be said with impunity and in the crudest of terms, even by some political figures. Next slide. The Pope is also concerned about a loss of silence and serene reflection. He thinks the world is too frenetic, and it blocks the serene reflection that could lead us to a shared wisdom. He's also worried about the loss of bonds between generations, and he calls for us to create bonds of integration between generations and different communities and avoid that all that makes us insensitive to others. Final slide here, and this is the final one of chapter 1. Hope. He ends on a word of hope, and he says the symbols of hope are all those first responders, medical personnel, first responders, and those doing essential jobs who in the midst of fear put their lives on the line. Okay, let's go on to the next slide, which is about the Good Samaritan. Something I think most of us are familiar with, that parable. And the Pope also says it's probably a commentary on Cain's statement. God asked him, "Where is your brother Abel?" And Cain says, "Am I my brother's keeper?" Let's go to the next slide here. And the Pope asks, which of these persons do you identify with? At the bottom is the Samaritan, helping the wounded man. Then there's the Levite and the priest who just pass by and ignore the wounded man. And so who do you identify with? Let's go to number 1, the Good Samaritan. The parable shows that the existence of each and every individual is deeply tied to that of others. Life is not simply time that passes. Life is a time for interactions. Next slide. And he also quotes St. John Chrysostom. Do you wish to honor the body of the Savior? Do not despise it when it is naked. Do not honor it in church with silk vestments, while outside it is naked and numb with cold. Next slide. With regard to the robbers, let's go to the next one now. He says there are secret allies, those who complain that everything is broken and can't be fixed. And it leads to the invisible dictatorship of hidden interests. Next slide. And the Pope asks sharp questions of the church. This is at the end of chapter 2 on the Good Samaritan. Why did it take so long for the church to unequivocally condemn slavery and various forms of violence. And why do some today feel permitted by their faith to support nationalism, xenophobia, and contempt for those who are different? Let's go to the next slide now. The final comment in chapter 2. He says, this needs a new catechesis in preaching to speak more directly and clearly about the social meaning of existence, the fraternal dimension of spirituality, our conviction of the inalienable dignity of each person, and our reasons for loving and accepting all our brothers and sisters. Now we go to chapter 3, envisioning and engendering an open world. Next, and he introduces us to the law of ecstasis. We're going to see a lot of Greek words in this presentation. This is a Greek word meaning the lover goes outside the self to find a fuller existence in another, and that humans always have to take up the challenge of moving beyond themselves. Next slide. And love should impel us towards a universal communion. It makes every periphery converge in a greater sense of mutual belonging. And the ever-increasing number of interconnections and communications in today's world makes us powerfully aware of the unity and common destiny of the nations. Unity and common destiny of the nations. That's one of the Pope's themes. Then he goes to social friendship. Social friendship does not mean socialism. We're going to hear the word social a lot in this encyclical and in my presentation. It doesn't mean socialism. It's more about attitudes. In fact, I think this is a Spanish term, a Spanish conception, and the translation into English, we're probably not so familiar with these kind of words. But this is what it is, a love capable of transcending borders. And genuine social friendship within a society makes true universal openness possible. It also leads to the acknowledgement of the worth of every human person. Yes, next, please. Then he goes on to a critique of market ideology, neoliberalism, as we call it. And he talks about fundamental human rights. What we need are states that look beyond the free and efficient working of certain economic, political, or ideological systems, and rather to those that are primarily concerned with individuals and the common good. Yes, next, please. And so he talks about economic doublespeak. Indeed, to claim economic freedom while real conditions bar many people from actual access to it, and while possibilities for employment continue to shrink, is to practice doublespeak. Today, there's a tendency to claim ever broader individual, I am tempted to say individualistic rights, as if the person were a monad, increasingly unconcerned with others. Next, please. And so he introduces us to some more terms on solidarity. My Greek isn't too good. I think it's pronounced agathosine, the attachment to the good, and benevolentia, which is a Latin word meaning an attitude that wills the good of others. And these lead to solidarity. Next slide, please. These are the attributes of solidarity: responsible for the fragility of others, a service that sets aside one's own wishes and is not ideological. It's not always well received, such as people who are serving refugees and immigrants. It acts in terms of community. It places the lives of all prior to the appropriation, prior to the appropriation of goods by a few. It combats the structural causes of poverty. So it is more than just sporadic acts of generosity. This is solidarity. It gets structural. And it shows care for our common home, the planet. He doesn't really go into environmental questions in this encyclical because I think he presumes we've read Laudato Si. Then he moves on to the social purpose of private property. Next slide. The social role of property. The principle of the common use of created goods is the first principle of the whole ethical and social order. The right to private property can only be considered a secondary right, derived from the principle of the universal destination of created good. So next slide, please. So the Pope talks about self-determination for the poor countries. We should recognize and respect not only the rights of individuals, but also the social rights and the rights of peoples. This means finding a way to ensure the fundamental right of peoples to subsistence and progress. Next, please. And the Pope says this should lead to a new humanity and an alternative way of thinking. Next slide, please. So this is the alternative way of thinking. A world that provides land, housing, and work for all. A true path of peace. A global ethic of solidarity and cooperation. And a shared responsibility in the whole human family. Let's now go to chapter 4, which is about human migration. Next slide, please. The Pope gives us 4 words, very important words. Welcome, protect, promote, integrate. Next slide. Just a few statistics. There's 272 million migrants living in countries not of their birth. In the United States, we have 42.5 million legal citizens and permanent residents. They're immigrants. The Americans abroad, we're probably not aware of that. Between 4 and 4.8 million Americans live in other countries, and many of them are legal residents in other countries, but they're still US citizens. And we have 11 million undocumented immigrants in America. That's a number staying the same. As new ones come in, others leave, and so it stays around 11 million. And in number 130, the Pope lists number 130, 19 specific actions that host countries should take to accomplish the 4 words that were mentioned in a previous slide, that welcome, protect, promote, and integrate. Then he goes on to the United Nations. They passed in 2018 the Global Compact of Migration, safe, orderly, and regular. Those are the 3 words from the compact. It has 23 objectives, each with its own set of goals. And he says, our response can only be the fruit of a common effort to develop a form of global governance with regard to the movements of migration. So that's what the UN called for, and that's what we call for. Then he goes on to the reciprocity of gifts. That previous picture, that was from Stamford, Connecticut, where the group there, they're mainly from the Congregational Church. They've welcomed about 4 or 5 families now, Syrian refugees, to Stamford. And this was a picnic that they were having. I just introduced that as the reciprocity of gifts. We give to them, they give to us. Let's move on to the next one. The Pope talks about his home country, Argentina, which benefited from Italian immigrants and 200,000 Jews living there. In the United States, we might not be aware of it, but 2/3 of those with PhDs in economics are immigrants. In the United States, in the year 2016, the 6 Americans who won the Nobel Prize, not the Nobel Peace Prize, Nobel Prizes, were all immigrants. Many innovators and entrepreneurs are immigrants. And the faculty of Princeton University, 2/3 of them are immigrants. We'll go to the next picture. Princeton University. Somebody, a professor there said, Princeton is like a mini United Nations since there are so many immigrants on the faculty there. Well, we'll move on to the next picture. Pope Francis says, but it's not just the utilitarian reasons for having migration. There is always the factor of gratuitousness, the ability to do something simply because they are good in themselves. Gratuitousness makes it possible for us to welcome the stranger, even though this brings us no immediate tangible benefit. Next slide, please. But he also says there's an innate tension between globalization and localization. So we welcome others who are different and value the unique contribution they have to make only if I am firmly rooted in my own people and culture. gives rise to a healthy and enriching exchange. The Pope criticizes what he calls local narcissism, who cannot appreciate the beauty, the potential and beauty of the larger world. And he says a healthy culture, on the other hand, is open to welcoming by its very nature. Indeed, a culture without universal values is not truly a culture. So 3 final comments. He talks about indigenous cultures. He says they should not have a static indigenism. They give to us, we can learn from them, but they can also learn from the modern world. He talks about lively urban neighborhoods. Maybe he had great experience in Buenos Aires. Maybe they have lively neighborhoods down there. I don't know if that's true of every city throughout the world. And he warns about powerful countries and large businesses who can play off poor countries against one another, called the race to the bottom. So the Pope says developing countries must negotiate as a bloc. Let's go on to chapter 5. This is called a healthy politics. Next slide, please. First, he begins by talking about populist and populism. And populism can exploit people demagogically for its own purposes. And he talks about a liberalism, really neoliberalism, that serves the economic interests of the powerful. And these words, populism and populist, have become very well used in recent years, but they can be a source of polarization. And it disregards the meaning of the word people. Next slide, people. The meaning of people. This comes from Latin America, I believe. I don't think we would use it this way here in the US, but it means to be part of a shared identity arising from social and cultural bonds, not something automatic, but a slow, difficult process of advancing towards a common project. But it can degenerate into an unhealthy populism when individuals try to exploit it politically. So we go to the next slide here. And he wants to talk about employment. He considers employment one of the prime issues throughout the world. In a genuinely developed society, work is an essential dimension of social life. Work gives us a sense of shared responsibility for the development of the world and ultimately for our life as a people. Next slide. Now he goes into a critique of neoliberalism. Pope Francis calls for charity that incorporates all elements. Otherwise, the shapers of public opinion will continue to promote an individualistic and uncritical culture subservient to unregulated economic interests at the service of those who already enjoy too much power. Next, please. And this is probably one of the more important statements. The marketplace by itself cannot resolve every problem, despite the dogma of neoliberal faith. It is imperative to have a proactive economic policy directed at promoting productive diversity and business creativity and makes it possible for jobs to be created. Financial speculation, fundamentally aimed at quick profit, continues to wreak havoc. Next, please. So he calls for building a common destiny. So what is needed is this model of social, political, and economic participation that can include many different elements, and also the torrent of moral energy that springs from including the excluded in the building of a common destiny. Yes, next. So, and then he has some comments about the financial crisis. Next, please. It did not result in rethinking of outdated economic criteria. And this century is witnessing a weakening of nation states, chiefly because transnational economic and financial sectors tend to prevail. Next, please. So the Pope calls for a world authority of some form. This is a hard sell in America. You call for a world authority in America and you'll be shut off the TV in the next second. So, but anyway, the Pope said this, authority that can promote more effective world organizations, that can provide for the global common good, work for the elimination of hunger and poverty, and ensure the defense of fundamental human rights. And the Pope lauds the UN founding charter, but says that the family of nations needs to acquire real teeth. So the UN is too weak to achieve those things. So, but that's what he's hoping for. Then he kind of concludes with healthy politics. What is it? A renewed appreciation of politics as a lofty vocation and one of the highest forms of charity, inasmuch as it seeks the common good. And I think it's the final line of this chapter, chapter 5. The most important question a politician should ask himself is, what good did I achieve in the position that was entrusted to me? Let's go on to chapter 6 on dialogue. We'll go to the next slide. You can just read these quickly. If you read these, you know, if you ever attended a workshop held by Human Resources, probably these are the exact same things that you would be taught or be asked to dialogue about or talk about. So it's just a bunch of good advice, a good counsel on what we can do in dialogue. Let's move on to the next thing. He also talks about the pursuit of truth. He's very strong on truth, and he uses consensus again in an unusual way. Once again, I don't know if he's translating from Spanish, where consensus has a different meaning. Consensus is generally considered a very positive word here in the United States. But he said sometimes consensus can be merely mirroring notions currently in void. He calls that an ephemeral consensus, and he contrasts that with dialogue. And he says what dialogue is, it needs to be enriched and illumined by clear thinking, rational arguments, a variety of perspectives, and the contribution of different fields of knowledge and points of view. Next, please. And he talks about fundamental truth here. I'm looking for my own thing here. So anyway, we can read it off the thing. The dignity of others is to be respected in all circumstances, not because that dignity is something we have invented or imagined, but because human beings possess an intrinsic worth superior to that of material objects and contingent situations. So this is a truth that corresponds to human nature apart from all cultural change. Through reflection, experience, and dialogue, we can come to recognize the basis of certain universal moral demands. So next, please. The culture of encounter. And he goes on to talk about this includes social peace. Once again, we're not talking about socialism. Social peace demands hard work and craftsmanship, integrating differences. That leads to a social covenant, recognizing other people's right to be themselves and to be different. And this is a cultural covenant, one that respects and acknowledges the different worldviews, cultures, and lifestyles that coexist in society. Next, please. And he talks about indigenous peoples. They have a different notion of progress, but we haven't quite reached that kindness yet. Their notion of progress is more humanistic, not meant to benefit the powerful. So lack of respect for indigenous cultures is a form of violence. Finally, kindness. He ends this chapter with some comments about that. Christotes, that's another Greek word, of course, it means kindness, from Galatians chapter 5. He says kindness ought to be cultivated. It's not a superficial bourgeois virtue. And perhaps we can leave this forum today vowing to perform at least one act of kindness every day, our Christian New Year's resolution. Let's go to chapter 7, peace and nonviolence. Actually, the Pope never mentions nonviolence. But some of the things he mentions are very similar to the tenets of nonviolence. Let's go on. Here he begins talking about truth and reconciliation. We're probably familiar with those Truth and Reconciliation Commissions in South Africa. He says the reason is people have a right to know what happened. We go on, and it includes an architecture of peace that pursues goals that benefit everyone, clearly identifies problems, and acknowledges that others have legitimate point of view. Then he talks about an art of peace. It involves us all and incorporates those sectors that have often been overlooked. Next, please. Forgiveness. Forgiveness does not mean renouncing our own rights. True love for an oppressor means seeking ways to make him cease his oppression. Martin Luther King talked about this as well. Love your enemy. He says the way you love your enemy, that is the oppressor, is by showing him through nonviolence his oppression, and maybe you'll convert him and get him to act justly. And so the Pope is saying something very similar here. So maybe he is talking about nonviolence. But he also says, do not be obsessed with anger or taking revenge. Then he goes on to reconciliation. Authentic reconciliation does not flee from conflict, but is achieved in conflict, resolving it through dialogue and open, honest, and patient negotiation. Conflict gradually changes into an honest discussion of differences founded on a desire for justice. Then he talks about memory. What about the Holocaust in Nazi Germany? The nuclear bombs dropped on Japan, the slave trade, ethnic genocides. We can never move forward without remembering the past, bearing witness to the horror of what happened, because that witness awakens and preserves the memory of victims so that the conscience of humanity may rise up in the face of every desire for dominance and destruction. So memory and justice. Forgiving does not mean forgetting, nor does it mean impunity. Justice is properly sought solely out of love for justice itself, out of respect for the victims, as a means of preventing new crimes and protecting the common good. Finally, he gets to some comments about three issues. War. He says people use all kinds of justifications for war, most of which are really not just. But he says there's a need to ensure the uncontested rule of law, tireless recourse to negotiation, mediation, and arbitration, as proposed by the Charter of the United Nations, which constitutes truly a fundamental juridical norm. Once again, he comes back to the UN. The UN should be very important. The Pope is very affirmative of the role that the United Nations plays in the world. He also says another reason why we shouldn't have war is never has humanity had such power over itself with modern weapons. And finally, he says with regard to war, if we grasp the abyss of evil at the heart of war, we will not be deemed naive for choosing peace. There are many people say, we will not end war. You're naive to think you will end war. But the Pope says he is not naive for choosing peace. Then he goes on to nuclear weapons. Next, please. Just next slide. He talks about the inadequacy of nuclear deterrence based on fear and mistrust. The ultimate goal of the total elimination of nuclear weapons becomes both a challenge and a moral and humanitarian imperative. So that's the teaching of the Pope. We must work towards the total elimination of nuclear weapons. He talks about, I don't know if he talked about it, maybe he did, the TPNW, the Treaty to Prohibit Nuclear Weapons, which was just came into force last week on January 22nd. 51 nations have now ratified it. Over 130 nations have signed it. Unfortunately, the 9 countries that have nuclear weapons are not signatories, but it puts pressure on them to try to reduce the number of nuclear weapons. Another good sign, the US and Russia are now apparently willing to extend the New START treaty, which was going to expire next month, but they're going to extend it for another 5 years. This limits the number of nuclear weapons that we can have to 1,500 or so nuclear, strategic nuclear warheads. Then he goes on at the end of chapter 7 to the death penalty. Just this simple statement: we state clearly that the death penalty is inadmissible and that the church is firmly committed to calling for its abolition worldwide. Final chapter here, the role of religions. Let's go on. First, he talks about totalitarianism. You can see denial of transcendent dignity, violation of fundamental rights of each person, a desensitized human conscience, no religious values, individualism, materialistic philosophies. I guess he feels necessary to condemn totalitarianism, but he talks about the public role of the church. It's not, the church does not restrict her mission to the private sphere. The church is out there serving, goes to accompany life, sustain hope, be a sign of unity, to build bridges, break down walls, and sow seeds of reconciliation. Next, please. He talks about religious freedom. One fundamental human right must not be forgotten. It is religious freedom for believers of all religions. And then he talks about religion and violence. Violence has no basis in our fundamental religious convictions, but only in their distortion. Each one of us is called to be an artisan of peace by uniting and not dividing. And he reiterates a quote from himself and the Grand Imam, Ahmad el-Tayeb. We resolutely declared that religions must never incite war, hateful attitudes, hostility, and extremism, nor must they incite violence or the shedding of blood. And finally, he gives us models of universal fraternity. As I mentioned at the beginning, unfortunately, they're all men. Where's a woman here? 5 men, famous men, no question about that. And then he ends with 2 prayers. Next slide. These are just short excerpts, a prayer to the Creator. So he wants us to be open to all peoples and nations on earth, and an ecumenical Christian prayer, discovering Christ in each human being. So in short, that is Fratelli Tutti. And I've had to race through it. I'm very sorry. But this was a long encyclical. I wanted to cover all 8 chapters and at least mention the main points of each chapter. So I guess we're open up now for questions. I didn't have time to read the chat box or anything.
Well, first of all, to answer many people's inquiry, yes, this is being recorded and you are going to be able to view it again on the Maryknoll website page. If there is any other source, it may be on our Maryknoll YouTube channel. I can let the attendees know. And when you see the recording of this, the slides will be on there. So that should answer that question.
I also have a full 18-page document of my script that I cut down. I eliminated half of it, but you can read that whole script. It's 18 pages, but in large print. And so it's probably the equivalent of a document around 14 or 15 pages or so with normal print. And I can send that out. Maybe I can send it to you, Chuck, and it can be sent out to anybody who wants it. You can also contact me, fjbreen@maryknoll.org, and I can send it out as an attachment.
And if anyone wants to contact me with any requests, my email address is lbottos, B as in boy, OTTOS, @maryknoll.org. So to answer more questions, yes, you will be able to get the script. One person asked St. Francis, Archbishop Tutu, Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., and the 5th was, I can't pronounce the last name, Blessed Charles de
Foucauld. Yeah, the one who worked in North Africa with Muslims. That was his mission, to work with Muslims, people of a different faith.
Okay. Are there any other questions? Well, I wish we were all live so we could give you a round of applause, Father Breen, for a really fabulous presentation. It was incredibly informative, and I was actually impressed at how much you covered in such a short period of time. So I want to thank everybody for joining us. We are working on our next Food for Thought presentation. Susan Gunn of Maryknoll Office for Global Concerns will be joining us in May, and we will be able to, I just saw someone wrote clap, clap, clap. Thank you, Father Breen. So I would encourage all of you to join us again. I hope you found that this first endeavor at a virtual webinar on Food for Thought was useful for you. And thank you all for joining us. And we hope to see you again in May. God bless you all.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Thank you.